Don't start timing me yet. The 5 minutes goes by very fast, so you have to wait till I'm ready. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Fantastic. So today I'm going to talk about open source project merge request workflow, and specifically how CI/CD pipelines come into the merge request workflow process. The reason I am talking about this topic today is, for one, I felt like I could get it in 5 minutes, but for real, the reason is that somebody posted a question in Slack that a customer had about this topic recently, and it made me think about the fact that I hadn't really considered how CI/CD pipelines come into effect when you have a forked project that you're making changes in and then having a merge request back. So the overall workflow is, and kind of to set the scenario, if I am someone who wants to contribute to an open source project, that's a public project where I can see all of the code, but I don't have access to be able to create a branch in that project, make changes, create a merge request directly in that repository. So instead, I'm going to fork that repository so I get my own private repository with all the history to be able to make the changes that I want to make and fully test them prior to creating a merge request with my master branch of the fork as the source and the master branch of the original open source project as the destination, so that someone who is an active member of that project can validate my changes and decide whether or not to approve that merge request and merge them into the open source project. And it's a workflow that works really well, that's been used for years and years now for open source projects, but I've never stopped to think about how do pipelines now come into play here? Well, in GitLab, if in the open source project, if you have a GitLab CI YAML file, then when I fork that repository, I'm going to get that same YAML file. So I, in essence, have pipelines available to run in my forked project, and that's great. If I have branch pipelines, when I push to the remote of my forked repo, I'm going to see branch pipelines running. And if I have merge request pipelines defined in my GitLab YAML file, when I create that merge request to merge back to the master in the open source repository, it's automatically going to run a pipeline to validate all of the changes that I've made, and I can see the results of that. And that's what we want to happen. So it sounds really great, but there's more here than meets the eye, because in a forked project, you don't have all of the project settings that you have in your original open source project. You have the source code and the CI file, but you don't have things like secrets that are defined in that open source project and other environment variables that you might need to run a pipeline effectively. There might also be some specific runner configurations for the runners being used in that open source project that you would know nothing about in your forked repository. And even things like Kubernetes cluster integration for review apps would not be available in that forked repository. So in essence, there's no way to guarantee that the pipeline that's being run in this forked repository is really going to give us the same results at all as the pipeline being run in the original open source repository. We've had a lot of customers struggle with this and ask for us to help solve this problem. They want to make sure that the code passes a pipeline prior to merging it into the original open source repository. And so there's good news here. And I was really, really excited about this because this is functionality that we've introduced in 13.3. Now, the most exciting part for me about this was 13.3 is coming on August 22nd. But due to the beauty of continuous deployment on GitLab.com, I was able to experience this functionality this week, which was super great. So here's what it looks like. When you create that merge request to merge back to the original repository, that merge request is going to be visible by those team members that are working on that open source project. And they're going to be able to see the pipeline that was run in my forked project and make sure that that makes sense. They'll also be able to do things like diff their code changes there. But now there's a new button available in the pipelines tab of that merge request to run that pipeline in the parent, the original open source project. So in essence, we're going to be able to validate that the pipeline runs successfully in our original project with those secrets and other variables and things we need prior to accepting those changes and merging them into our open source repository. Now, there are a couple of gotchas here. So some things that you have to think about. And I got tripped up on this one. We don't necessarily always use merge request pipelines by default. You have to have merge request pipelines defined in your GitLab CI YAML file, or else you're not going to see any of this and you're going to wonder what happened. Also, the person in the open source project who's reviewing that merge request needs developer permissions or greater, or else they're not going to see that button to run the pipeline. And then the final thing that we actually pop up a warning message about, so everyone should be aware of this, it's possible that a malicious actor might try to commit changes that would effectively, when we run the merge request pipeline, expose secrets that they would be able to then take and get access to our assets that we don't want them to access. So you have to be careful and make sure you're actually looking at the code changes and understanding what those code changes are, and that there are no security vulnerabilities before running that pipeline in the open source project. And that's all I have for today.